have some areas that are, I don't want to say any area is easy, because there's really, I mean, when it comes to planting a church, if you have successfully planted a church, it shows a couple things. It shows that God has been with you and met you every step of the way, and He has called you and blessed you, and that He's given you some of the gifts that Ed talks about, including the gift of leadership and so forth. And so it's not to take away from anyone in what we call maybe traditionally easier areas. But there definitely are, and some of you are heading out to some areas that are a little bit more challenging, uniquely so. And so we want to talk about some ideas. And really, what really made that hit home for me is I was in, and some of you, how many people here, like, you live in California, just so I can get an idea? Okay.
Don't move, it's beautiful here.
Yeah. Well, unless God's calling you.
Yeah, if God calls you, you got to go. But if not,
yeah,
stay here, it's really nice.
I think if we were going to hold a contest for who's got the most difficult area, you're Germany, right? So hands down, you win. There's no prize, but you win the hardest place probably.
Yeah.
But anyone else head to the northeast or some other areas like that?
Santa Monica.
All right.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Nowhere as hard as Germany, because they don't even have a sense of humor. So he didn't
He's
even
gonna
smile.
kill
He's
you.
smiling. He's smiling. He's smiling.
That's a violent smile. So
I'm joking. My favorite comedian is actually German.
all right, we're going to move on. We're going to move on. So what happens? One day I was I left my house, and it was the year before last, and we had just violent winter. And so I was there, and I was outside, and I was scraping ice off the ground, off the car, shoveling snow, and all of this is just to get in my car and go to work. And then I thought about this guy and other people in other places like California and Florida. I'm like, man, some of these guys, they can just get in their car and go, but this is a lot of work just to kind of get started and go in the morning. And I think that's when it comes to difficult areas, there are some things that we have to realize. There are some areas where the ground has already been plowed and there's a little bit less groundwork to do, and yet there are some other areas that it takes a little bit, and it's just realizing that and realizing some things that you can do about that. And so what we hope today is you walk away encouraged. And I think what Bob would say too is, rather than just a lot of big picture ideas, we're really going to try to get into some nuts and bolts for you today and have some practical things. I have my Bible. We may not open it. It doesn't mean we don't believe in it or love Jesus. We do. But we really want to kind of give you guys some practical nuts and bolts things and maybe leave some time for Q&A at the end. So let's go ahead and get into the first contrarian idea, and that's this, is that the experts, when it comes to the difficult places, the experts are not the experts. Now, that sounds a little bit arrogant, doesn't it? Like, oh, well, who are you guys? You're the experts? And I'm not saying I'm an expert by any means, and I don't think Bob would get up and claim to be an expert either. But what we're trying to say is you guys have all probably gone to conferences and seen, I think Ed had a great word for it. It's like ministry porn. We go to an area and see this great thing that God is doing, and we get excited about that, and maybe they're in the South or a different area, completely different than where you're going to minister to, and if you don't contextualize, you can take ideas that work very well in a certain area, bring them to another area, and it could completely fail and not work at all, because when it comes to some of these things, the experts aren't the experts.
Yeah, one of the things that happens too, and this can even happen if you are coming out of a larger church. And let me tell you a little bit of my story. You know, we came out of Calvary Fort Lauderdale, which is a huge church, and I went to start our church. We started, it was my wife and I and 5 people. And then the second week, one couple didn't really like it. And so it was my wife and I and 3 people, which at that rate, we weren't going to really survive that much longer. And so, but what happened was that as we got started, one of the things that I tried to do was not really just see what God wanted to do with the people that He brought and begin to kind of build from there. I had an idea that I had been part of a large church, and so I was going to do a big church with 5 people. And it sounds totally ridiculous until you get into it, and then you realize, like, man, maybe I have done that. And you say, well, because we want to make sure that when we get going, we have this ministry and this ministry and this ministry. And this is one of the things, is I work with church planners all the time. In fact, that's probably the thing I've done probably the most the last 3 or 4 years. And one of the things that I see is guys come out of churches, they want to start, and they don't do it the first, I'm not saying you're going to do that your first service. But what will happen is that after 3 or 4 months, you kind of, you're getting your sea legs, so to speak, and you're getting your stride as to, you got Sundays going, maybe doing a midweek. And then it's like, well, now we're going to start a men's ministry. Now we're going to start a women's ministry. And what happens most of the time with church planners, in my experience, is that they start ministries too soon. They start ministries when they don't have enough critical mass to make this thing happen. And then what it ends up becoming is just another item that the pastor then has to take care of, manage, and this is one of the reasons why pastors and church planners in particular get so burnt out, is because they're taking on way more than they should be getting going as they're getting started.
Yeah, and I think one of the things when it comes to your area, again, whether you're looking at a Greg Laurie, a Rick Warren, an Andy Stanley, you can learn things from every single one of those, but just taking them and trying to plug and play in your area is a dangerous thing, because we've acknowledged that there are some areas that are a little bit harder, but one of the things that I think is important for a church planner to understand is what makes your specific area, the place God has called you to, the people group God has called you to, what specifically makes it more challenging than some areas? And you need to know specifically why that is. So, Bob, let me ask you, what would make, you say when we come to Miami, what makes that a uniquely challenging area versus some other areas?
Yeah, Miami's very Latin, and so there's, in many respects, there's to some degree, in Miami, 55% of people speak a language other than English as the first language in their home. So that's not the defining issue, but it's an issue that we have to deal with, which is a language issue. There's cultural issues where people are coming from Central America, South America. Miami is very Cuban, so you have a lot of that. So this is if there's a place where there's really a melting pot. I mean, South Florida is one of those places. But that's very different than, and the thing that happens is, the reason why that's important is people are coming from areas where there isn't a lot of church background. So when we reach people, we're reaching people predominantly who have no church background whatsoever. So to look at a model, per se, that's coming out of the Bible Belt or doing something very well in the Bible Belt is probably not going to translate. In fact, when I meet with, I had lunch with a guy who's coming to plant a church next year in near Miami. He's not going into Miami, he's going near Miami. And he said, what's the first thing I need to know? And I said, I need you to take all the books you've read about church and throw them all away, because none of it works here. Most of them have been written by guys who are in the Bible Belt, guys who are ministering in predominantly churched areas, and those ideas aren't going to work here. You've got to be in many ways a missionary in your own community. I know we're going to talk about that, but you've got to really go into your area saying, what is unique about this area? What is unique about the people that I'm trying to minister to? And then how do I go about in communicating the gospel in a way that connects with them? And that's why we tell guys all the time, don't think so much like a church planner. Think like a missionary as you're going into your city to plant your church.
Yeah, and so I should share with you what makes our area a little bit challenging. So in Hartford, Connecticut, it's an area that is quite affluent. Connecticut, it's one of the richest states, if not the richest state in the U.S. A lot of academia, we've got Yale in Connecticut, there's a lot of universities, a lot of Ivy League schools not far from there. And so it's the intellect. And when you look at some of the things that hold people back from the gospel, it's affluence. They think that they have enough. It's intellect. They think that they're smarter. And so you come in and you realize that these are some of the barriers in our area that you're going to face. And every area has its idols, the things that it clings to rather than the gospel that you're trying to, in some ways, you've got to help shatter those with the gospel and help people see why their idols are inferior, why Jesus is superior. And so when we go into an area, you have to understand that. And I felt very bad, and that's why you have to understand your area. And God can do anything in any area, but some of you are uniquely equipped and gifted to do certain areas. For example, we had a guy that came from the South, and he tried his best. He was a great guy, and I think he could do a church very well. But in our area, he had a deep Southern drawl. And the problem is, in Connecticut, and I said, stubborn Yankees that we are, you start speaking in a southern drawl, they're deducting 50 IQ points off of you. And you know that there's certain areas that are like that. And so you just realize when you go in, you have to understand what that is. And so now practically, how then can we figure out what are some of the ways that we can determine? And I think this is where maybe we've heard some disparaging things about people that'll just go in and look at demographic studies and psychographic studies. But I think one of the things that we have to do as church planners, Bob said be missional. Well, what does that mean? You wouldn't go to France without learning the language, learning the culture, understanding the people groups that you're in. And I think part of what that means is in our areas, you've got one hand you're studying, the Word, and in the other hand you're studying the world around you, the cosmos. What is the nature of the people around you? And I think it's just as valid. Don't throw that out and think, well, it's just preaching the Word. As Ed said, make sure you're studying the people that you're preaching to. Not so you change the message. We never change the message. But there are ways we can present the message that connects and resonates with certain people groups more than others. And I don't know if you'd add anything else to that.
Nope.
All right, so let's go on to the second one. And let me ask you, how many of you, raise your hands if you've already planted? All right, good for you. And how long have you been planted?
A year.
A year? And someone was over here was planted?
23 years.
23 years, all right.
You're just getting started.
We got it. We planted.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
That's awesome. So we won't spend too much time probably on this one because you may not need it right away, but here's a principle we want to drop, and here's the second contrarian principle, and that's hire locals, not free agents.
Yeah, one of the things that when a church gets going and they start reaching people and they want to begin to add staff, one of the challenges, or maybe one of the temptations that we have is to say, well, I'm going to call back to my home church and see if there's anybody they can spare and have them come out. And we have chosen not to do that in our context for several reasons. And Bill and I have talked about this in his context. And one of the reasons is, and I've seen this, and I was, you guys know Bill Ritchie, pastors, I don't know, several hours north of here. But that was one of the things that he was saying. He says, I get some guy from Southern California who comes up and he just can't deal with the fact that in my state it rains a lot. And so one of the things that you want to make sure that you do, and this is not a hard and fast rule, but just I would say more often than not, you want to look to bringing staff who are already within your church. They understand the culture, they understand the city, they understand the vision of the church. And sometimes it's difficult to bring someone in from another area who doesn't understand that. And I think one of the things, early on, we brought in, he helped, this is a guy who helped to start the church, a great guy, and one of my closest friends. But it wasn't a good match. He would admit that he was not a great match in the community. Like I said, we live and minister in Miami. It's very Latin. You got to understand that, Latins like worship their kids. So that teaches us a little bit about...
They worship tardiness.
Yeah, there's a reason it's called Miami time. But there's a lot. It's important for us. So he came in, and he was clashing with all this, and it's like you got to understand this culture, and some guys just have that gifting, and they can look at the culture and be cross-cultural. And I know sometimes it sounds funny because we're like, well, really, we're still in America, and we got to talk about being cross-cultural. Of course we do. Of course we got to talk about being cross-cultural because we want to communicate the gospel not in a way that's easiest for us to understand, but it's easiest in the person that we're trying to reach for them to understand. And that might mean that we have to do some things that are a little bit different for us, but make a whole lot of sense for them. And that's why one of the things that I think is important is hiring people, bringing people on staff in your church that understand the culture, understand the city. If you've got somebody who's been in the suburbs their whole life and you bring them into a downtown area, that might be, some people really excel at that. Some people have a really difficult time. A good friend of mine pastors in New York City, and he said one of the biggest challenges he has in bringing in staff is that, he'll have a guy that, lived in Atlanta most of his life, and, for whatever, $1,000 a month or in a mortgage, he can have this humongous house, where that, he's going to pay, in the city, he's going to pay twice as much for a 600 square foot apartment, which is like the size of a restroom, in Atlanta. And that, as simple as that may sound, sometimes that's just it's a little bit too much of a barrier for people to cross and make it long-term in a particular area.
Yeah, and I think, and we'll take it and apply it to where you guys are here in a second, but I think on the one hand, it is more easy to call a friend from back home. Your church begins to grow and you say, hey, you want to come out here? And I get that, and there's something to that, and there's something maybe valid to that sometimes. But here's maybe where I'll challenge you. As Bob said, and I had the same experience too, I brought someone in and they just couldn't hack the area. Great person, very talented person, very competent, good character, all that, but they just couldn't stay in the area, so they didn't stay. But here's another thing. The reason sometimes we do that is because we take the shortcuts and we don't have an effective system for raising up leaders. We go back to the systems idea again and again. The reason we grab people from other churches is because we don't make our own disciples. We don't raise them up. I remember Bob Coy, our old pastor, used to tell the story all the time where he started growing. He's like freaking out. He needed an admin pastor, and he called, and at the time it was Romaine, and you know his gift of mercy. And so Bob's freaking out, and he says, I need you to send someone. I need an administrative pastor. And the way Bob tells the story, he's like, raise up your own disciples, Coy, and hangs up on him. And so, and that might have been a little hard and a little cold, but I think there's some truth to that, is we've got to raise up our own disciples. If we're not raising up leaders, we are failing the future generation, because people aren't going to stay if there's not opportunity to be discipled and to grow up. And so from the very beginning, even in the planting stages, begin thinking, what's your system for raising up leaders to be your future staff? Bob does a great thing. I don't have time to probably get into it here, but he has a great farm system. There's a single A, double A, triple A, major leagues and all that. And there's a whole system of people that you raise up on different tiers of leadership. And you could do that a million different ways, but the key is the how you do this is start raising up leaders and start doing that at early.
Yeah, we're talking about that tomorrow, and I think they have it in the mentor track, but I would say that I think that's be very valuable for you guys as well, because it's how to take people who are just coming to know the Lord and bring them on a track of discipleship where there's they get to a place of leadership, staff, and then even being sent out as planters as well.
Yeah, so that's number two. The third contrarian idea is that recent movers are the easiest to reach. Now let me share with you a little bit and then why, and we'll get practical. So when we moved to Connecticut, I was gung-ho, and I just went, it was me, my wife, and daughter at the time, the three of us, because I couldn't trick any of my friends into going to Connecticut from South Florida. Just they didn't want to go. And praise God, we've grown now. There are 5 of us on staff. We're hitting 360 on Sundays, and praise God for that. But when we started, it was 3 of us. And what would happen is people started to come. I was very disappointed because I'd meet somebody and they'd say, oh yes, we just relocated from California. Oh, we're from Arizona. Oh, we're from Florida. And I'm like, okay, on the one hand, I'm great that anybody's showing up because that's better than the 3 of us that were showing up. However, I thought we came to reach the natives, and what's going on here? And so what God showed me is if you go to a difficult area, what it means is there's probably a vacuum of solid Christ-teaching churches in that area. And so it's very valid. Not only you do need to reach the natives, but it's also very valid to create a home for people that have felt disenfranchised because there's not a church that they can go to in that area. And that's something God showed me, the dual nature of the mission. Now, I'll add this. What I realized, to avoid what Ed said as far as them becoming just simply consumers and spectators, is I always vision cast. Once they come in, I say, welcome, we're so glad you're here. You're in a strange and foreign land than what you're used to. But understand, you are now on a missions trip. God may have brought you here for school, for job, or for whatever, but God has brought you here to be salt and light in a very dark community, so you're on a missions team. If you join this church, you're on a missions trip with us here. And so we've redirected that. But all that to say, now to back up and get practical, what we found is it's easier to reach these people that are from other areas that are Christians. They bring resources, they know about serving, and then you get them to join and help you reach the natives, because it's easier when you have that team approach and more people to help you reach them. And so I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about some of the strategies that we've used.
No, well, I was going to ask you, because I think this is an area where you've really excelled. So if I can interview you for a second, and I have this mic because I have dope rhymes. But So what are some practical ways that you guys have used to reach people that are just moving into a community?
Okay, so very different from reaching people that are unchurched. If people are moving into a community and they're Christians, and again, it's valid if we're not stealing them from other churches, right? If they move to the area, they need to find a good church, and it might as well be your church. So first thing, get on every single web directory that's free for churches that you can. There's Church Angels, there's FlockFind, there's all kinds of church directories. The more that you can have them linking to you, the better as it comes to searching. I'll talk in a minute about web presence. But one of the other things we did is, and I know for some that you're not comfortable with it, but we do direct mail. We do a pretty substantial amount of direct mail. So if anyone moves into our area, we have a welcome card, and if anyone wants to see any of that, I can email you some of our designs for what we've done for new movers. It simply says, welcome to the area, get connected at Calvary Fellowship. We show photos of what our church is like, because for some people, they see contemporary worship. We've had people say, oh, I came because I saw drums. I have a picture of me on the back, not because I'm not one of these guys that I have to have my face on every billboard or every bus stop or anything like that. But what happens is that people say, oh, you're not an old dude in a robe yelling. You actually smiled on the back of your, like all these things, having kids, like all your different components tells a story and it shows a picture of who you are. So we've done direct mail, has been very helpful for us. We've done some servant evangelism, but that doesn't reach necessarily the new movers as much. But one of the other big things that we've done is internet, and I don't know if you want to get into that side of it. There's two sides of that.
You can if you want to.
All right, so while we're there, the internet is your friend, since you probably aren't going to move into a situation with brick and mortar and a big sign. And there's two sides that you need to master when it comes to really having an effective web presence. One is organic web presence, and that ties to getting your name on all the different sites that I mentioned and working on your what's called search engine optimization. And that's how people put in keywords like church and whatever town you're going into, Boise, church Boise. You want to be amongst the first people that come up organically, and the other way that you can do that is through Google Ads. Now, let me just say a couple things. So there's the two sides of them, and they're both valid, and they actually kind of work in tandem. A couple things when it comes to search organically. One of the things that you want to do, and I'll give you, here's a free thing that you should go home and do today, because again, Google has complicated algorithms. We won't get into all that today, but one of the things is if your name of your church or website is somehow in the keyword search, then it helps drive up that ranking and you'll appear higher. So for example, going back to if you're planting church in Boise, one of the best things you can do is go home today and register the domain churchboise.com. Right? And even if you don't have that as your website, forward that to whatever, Calvary Boise or whatever it's going to be, and that will help when people are searching that in, that will come up, and that will help drive it. Now, why is that important? Because again, if someone's moving to the area, they're not going to know how to find you if you don't have a building unless you've got some kind of web presence. And more, let me ask you, how many guys open up a Yellow Pages when you're looking for a business or a restaurant today? How many Google? Yeah, or another search engine. Yeah, so that's where people are. And so I think the Apostle Paul, he went to where people were, the crossroads and the centers of influence. I think Paul would be all over the internet at this point in time. So I don't know if you want to talk about the ads at all, or
No, just so we can cover everything. I'll go on to this is the fourth one.
Fourth one.
Fourth one is we call it this: focus on truth and leave the gimmicks to the circus. This is the. All right, I'm trying to be nice here. I hear about all of the internet is a great thing because it tells us about you hear about everything God is doing all over the world, and then you hear about like the crazy stuff people are doing. And one of the things that's been really good for me is to get to know pastors in my area, and different denominations and guys with different philosophy of ministry and all that. And I would just say this: I think we can learn from everybody, but I think part of, if you've gotten anything out of this conference, I think one of the important things is this: learn from everybody, but filter it through who you are and filter it through who we are as a movement. And that's why I think one of the things that I see when the sole goal is chasing growth, and see, I think we would believe something very different about growth. We would believe that growth is the outflow of health. And if you focus on the health of your church, Growth is a natural byproduct of that. And I think one of the things, and one of the temptations that we have, is just to do silly things that get people, that we think is going to get people's attention. Now, and a lot of times, like there's a guy that I know, and so he wanted to do this whole series on like good and evil. Just, there's evil in the world. How do we talk about that? So he decided to do this whole thing that was all themed around Star Wars. And now I am like the biggest Star Wars geek in the world, and I teach my kids to do likewise. And I will readily admit that. However, when you have your greeters dressed up as Chewbacca, I think you may want to rethink that. When all R2-D2 is receiving the offering, you may want to rethink that. And now here's what happens, and this is what.
And by the way, you're not kidding, right?
No, that's not a joke.
Okay.
That really happened.
Yeah.
And anyway, I talked to him, and it was like, well, that went over like screen doors on a submarine. And now here's the thing that's important. And these guys, and I'm not telling you this because I don't know these guys. I'm saying I know a lot of these guys. And what I would say is this: a lot of times, the reason and the heart behind why they do this stuff is good and noble. They say, we do this stuff because we think it makes a cultural connection and we're going to reach unchurched people. But the problem with that is a person does not go to church because they want to learn more about Anakin Skywalker's background, okay? They go to Comic-Con for that, right? You guys have that here, right? See, people go to a church because there's something happening in their lives that leads them to say, what I'm doing in my life is not working. And there is a desire and hunger for the gospel. They may not even be able to articulate that. And so I really believe that our job, and once again, I realize that we're preaching to the choir, but I think it's important for us to just kind of know who we are, focus on truth. Now, do we want to communicate that in a way that's interesting? I think some guys think it's a badge of honor to be boring. Let me just tell you a little thing. It's like, I hear guys say, some parts of the Bible are just boring. What part is that? Maybe you're boring. Maybe that's the problem. But listen, I know this. Everybody's allergic to boring. And so what you want to do is you want to do what you can to make the passage more interesting, to make it relatable, to make it practical. But once again, I think the gimmicky stuff we think will have an impact. And what I see over and over again is that it doesn't. What it reaches is disgruntled, churched people that are kind of looking for what the new show in town is, and it's just it doesn't help you. I know this is kind of a preaching to the choir kind of thing. We talk about this stuff in different environments, but so anyway, let's move on from this one.
All right.
Unless people want to talk about Chewbacca some more.
No, and I would only add to that. Look, being culturally relevant and understanding when someone comes that you can speak to the language and understand what they're dealing with, that's, I think, essential. But that really it's kind of like, Paul Mars Hill. You may speak from that vantage point to open the doors to deeper communications, but you don't build the series around it. You don't dress up like it. And
no one has ever said, that guy dressed as Han Solo who led worship really put me in the presence of the Lord. Probably has never happened.
And that's why you came to this conference, to get
Yes,
that right there.
yeah.
So you could go home now.
You got your money's worth now, that's for sure.
Fifth contrarian point, and this is going to tie to some of what we've heard already this weekend, is be missional and attractional. Now, this is interesting. Or as it was said yesterday, you could say be organic and strategic. You see, what we've seen so many times is there's a false divide. Are we going to be organic or are we going to be strategic? Are we going to be missional or are we going to be attractional? Do I need to define missional and attractional? Do you guys all kind of get that? All right, so anyway, just for a quick in case, the idea in the church world, and Ed Stetzer wrote, Breaking the Missional Code. He introduced that word to a lot of church planners. The idea of missional is like, hey, we go out and we go tell people about Jesus. We live amongst them, and it's like this slower, organic process versus attractional. And many attribute that to maybe the seeker model, like the come to church, and we'll tell you about the gospel and share with you. And it's sort of this divide, the missional and attractional. And in my mind, it's both, right? Because Jesus had the go and tell, or the missional, and he also had the come and see, or the attractional. And so I think for a church to be effective, you want to be able to do both effectively, because there are two different strategies. You're going to have to reach the people that have some sense of connection already with your church, and that is more of the missional approach. But what about the person that's got zero connection to your church, that doesn't know anybody in your church? How are you going to reach them? And that's where some of the attractional stuff comes in.
Yeah, we call this the spheres of outreach. There's 3 spheres of outreach. There's what we call the internal, the peripheral, and the external. The internal is people who are in your church. How do you do outreach? Well, when someone's in your church, you preach the gospel. You give them an opportunity to respond. We have a saying in our church: we never make anyone wait 2 weeks to hear the gospel. They show up, they're going to hear the gospel, they're going to have an opportunity to come forward, they're going to have an opportunity to receive Christ and be transformed by the power of the Holy Spirit. At the same time, there are people who aren't they aren't in our church, but they are connected to someone. That's what we call it, the peripheral, that they are connected to someone who attends our church. And what I mean by that is they're the next door neighbor of someone who attends our church. They're the classmate of someone who attends our church. They're the co-worker of someone who attends our church. They're the family member or friend that could be invited, they could just do personal evangelism with them and share the gospel with them, and or invite them to a church service, and they have obviously the opportunity to do both. But then there's this third, what we call the external, and that is people who have no connection to your church whatsoever. Now, when you're a church planner and you show up to a city, do you know what percentage it is of those who have no connection to your church whatsoever? It hovers right around 100%. Because you came into a city and nobody knows you. Maybe you and a team are coming in, and so your team knows who you are, and they have a couple of neighbors and friends, but for the most part, you've got to put together, once again, I'm going to use that word strategy, but you want to put together some strategies to think through, how are we going to reach people that have no connection to our church whatsoever? And there's several different ways to do that, but I think one of the keys, you've got to think through all 3 of these groups, the internal, the peripheral, and external. How are we going to reach out to those people? And I really believe that it's about being missional and attractional. There are some people that you can give them training, you can give them word for word what to say, if they, to witness to someone. You give them all the apologetics training, so will they become the spitting image of Norm Geisler, and they are just not going to do it. And and you can fight that all day long, and you're welcome to do that, or you can just train those who are ready, willing, and able to be trained, and that will embrace that. And then there are those who aren't going to embrace it for whatever reason, and say, you may not feel comfortable, giving the Romans road to somebody, but you can give someone a little invite card and say, hey, I would love for you to come with me to church on Sunday. I think you'd really enjoy it. And so there's that attraction element, but we're also doing the other side. And one of the things that's important, if I can just follow this rabbit for just a second, I think it's important for us to just not create these false dichotomies where it's one or the other. I think where we've always been as a movement is in striking a balance. And I think even when it comes to this idea of missional and attractional, we strike a balance to where, we're not going to do the dancing bears, attractional, but that's probably more extreme. We're also, probably not going to be like what some would call extreme on the missional side, which is kind of an us for no more idea, but balance to where we say, hey, we're going to take the very best of both, because our goal is not necessarily promote a method. Our goal is to promote the man, the man Christ Jesus. So do both, missional and attractional.
Yeah, and a couple of practical takeaways. One of the things Bob mentioned is having invite cards to give to your people. They're super cheap, easy. Get a good graphic designer. By the way, don't hand out things that look lame or ridiculous. Seriously, aesthetics do matter, because people, it's important to people. And
yeah, when it said, instead of saying great singing and it says great sinning, it has a whole different connotation.
Spell check matters, yes, and make sure there's certain things. And by the way, when you do a card, some people feel like, I've got to get the gospel. No, you don't. The goal of an invite card is to get them to church, and then you present the gospel at church, right? We sure hope you're doing that, but understand what the piece is for. It's an invitation. You give it to your people. Also, train people. There is an expectation that you're a partner. We're expecting you to invite your friends to church. At our church, we do have membership, and that's one of the things we tell them in the membership class. We're expecting you to tell your friends about Jesus. We're expecting you to tell them about the very best thing in your life, the thing that separates you from hell, and that puts you in heaven next to Jesus. Why wouldn't you want to tell people about that? And so encouraging and equipping. And on the other side is you need systems in place for when people do show up. And again, not being seeker-driven where we're doing all kinds of ridiculous stuff to impress people, but friendly, right? That's a good thing we learned from the seekers, is being friendly, being kind, having greeters in place, having systems in place. We give everybody that comes to our church a welcome gift with like a USB with different message series on there. Invite some different things that we've put together to let them know while we're not basing our church, we're not going to build it on the seeker. We are going to make sure we acknowledge you're there. We appreciate you coming, and we would like you to come back and keep learning about Jesus.
One of the big philosophical differences, this doesn't get talked about a lot, but one of the biggest philosophical differences in like a seeker movement as opposed to a Calvary Chapel or churches like Calvary Chapel is when we talk about like, seeker sensitive, the focus, everything that happens on Sunday in more of that kind of environment is focused on the person who doesn't know the Lord. Once again, it's not a horrible thing to like, hey, we want to see people saved. The problem is when we do church. Once again, that's why I think that the whole seeker model, it's not a philosophical issue. It's an it's an issue of ecclesiology. The primary role of the church is to glorify God. We get together as a church. Our primary goal is not building believers. Our primary goal is not reaching seekers. Our primary goal is to glorify the Lord. That's why we get together as a church. Then, do we want to make sure that unbelievers come to know the Lord? Of course. Do we want to make sure that believers are built up and matured in the faith? Of course. But it's with this fundamental understanding. That's why philosophy is so important. That's why theology is so important, because these things drive what we do.
Yeah. And the next point, that's a great transition to the next point, and we probably won't spend too much because I think we're preaching to the choir in this audience on this one, and that is deeper is better. See, a lot of people that have bought in, especially to reach seekers, that what you need to do is somehow water down the messages and water down the gospel and not offend by whatever it is that we're sharing.
Sorry, I've been waiting for that call.
Can you take it? All right.
It's a pizza. I ordered.
Right.
I think they're here.
All right. So, yeah, a lot of people that have done that. And we've seen, and we're not going to name names, we know preachers that have built whole sermon series around an illustration. And is that not backwards? Don't you build it around the Bible and then maybe build your illustrations on top of that to help you do it? We saw a whole series that was designed around espresso. I mean, that's kind of weird, right? I mean,
that's not a joke either.
No, that's not. I won't even name names to protect the guilty at this point. But we've seen this kind of stuff, and that's not it. And I think what happens is the reason is we think again that sometimes a seeker may come in and they want to have everything catered to them. That the reality is people want to be told truth. People want to be told what is real, and we've had enough with politicians, particularly, telling us what they think we want to hear and catering to that. Now, I will say, there is a way to present, you can say what you mean and say it mean and get people upset unnecessarily, right? We don't need to be fire and brimstone about it. You can say absolutely true. Coach Joe, this guy I learned from, you kick butt with a smile on your face. You can say the hardest truths that are in the Bible. But you can also, and Chuck Smith, what a greater model than Chuck Smith, and to say hard truth with a smile on your face, and people get your heart too. And so if you have a heart and a compassion, you want to reach them, they sense that coming through too if you're authentic and you're real. So I don't know how much more we need to get into. I think, again, we're preaching to the choir, but I don't know if there's anything you want to add on that.
Let's move on.
Okay. You want to take number 7?
Yeah, give me the hard one. That's good.
That's how I like to do it.
All right, we call this one number 7, focus on your brand, not your affiliation. This is especially true if you're going into a difficult area that isn't very churched. A lot of times, one of the things that I see, and I see this with not just in Calvary circles, but I see this in other denominations as well, or other movements, is the focus is, man, we want to just kind of let people know about who we're affiliated with. And I see this, I got a piece of direct mail at my house this past year around Christmas time, and they were doing this whole, the church was doing this whole series around, what's that thing called? The Grinch. Which anyway, I'll move on from that. But yes, thank you. How the Grinch Stole Christmas. Thank you. And so, but the reason I tell you this is that they had 4 icons between the front and the back of this postcard to their denomination. I mean, I'm a pastor. I've never even heard of their denomination or their movement or whatever, and I've been around for a while, and I'd never even heard of them, and it was this whole kind of focus on, well, we just want to tell, you want to tell people where you come from. This is going to sound so weird, but just forgive me. Most people in your church don't care. Like, they just don't. Now, it's important to us, and it's important that we have, we're not just kind of out there, on our own, kind of making it up as we go along. But I think it's just an important thing that as you let people know about your church and all of that, sometimes we can get so focused on where we come from, our history and all that, people don't come to a church. The study came out that only 6% of people choose a church based on the denomination or movement that they're associated with. This is one of the, I used to run the Bible college in the Bible college extension at Calvary Fort Lauderdale. That was my main responsibility. And I would see guys that are like, man, I can't wait to finish Bible college, and then we're going to hang our dove. And I remember we would tell you, like, you do know that the dove is not like the golden arches, billions of billions served. But there's sometimes this mentality, like, no matter where I go, if I hang the dove, everyone will know where I'm from, what we're all about. If you go outside of areas where Calvary is known, or whatever your particular brand is, there isn't, the point being, I just wouldn't focus so much on that, because people don't know about the movement that you're from, about the group that you're from. It's probably not as helpful as just letting people know, hey, this is our church, this is our God, this is when our services are. We'd love for you to come. We'd love for you to hear the gospel and see God do a great work in your life.
Amen. Yeah, and just to add to that, I had a friend who's a peer who was a church planner in Connecticut, and that was his obsession. As soon as I get the dove, the masses are going to come. I'm like, no, they're not, because they never heard of it out here. It's in Connecticut. I mean, in California, there may be some areas where it's to your advantage. You put the Calvary Chapel name, and that may be very helpful, at least for people giving you a shot and checking you out. In a lot of areas, it's not bad, it's not negative, it's nothing. They've not heard it. And so focusing instead, I think it was Bruce in the workshops yesterday said this, people are more concerned with your sort of tribal stories, your ethos of your church. And so vision casting, who are you as a local church in your area? What do you want to see? How do you want to see God transform lives? How do you want to see Him transform your community? And vision casting for what He's doing in your local church. And I guarantee you, people will be more enamored with that. They may appreciate Calvary Chapel, particularly if they have a background in it and hearing some of the stories there. But they don't want to hear about, what happened in the summer of '69 in Southern California. They want to hear about what's going on right here and now, where they live, with the people that are amongst you. And so I just want to encourage you, sure, share where you came from, but also understand God's doing a new thing in your area with you, and you're pioneers in that area. So make sure your people catch a vision for that too.
Yeah, the next one is think like a missionary, not a church planner. We touched on that, and so we're gonna punt. We already talked about it because we want to give a few minutes for questions.
We'll go to number 8.
Go for it.
All right. The toughest battle you face is often the battle within. Church planners, this is probably going to be helpful to you at some point in time, because here's what happens. We all get excited. God gives us a vision. He confirms a call. We step out, and then we discover something. It's harder than anybody ever told us it was going to be. And maybe it's slower, and especially some of you guys come from awesome churches. We came from Calvary Fort Lauderdale. We would see 50, 75, 100 people get saved at a service. I mean, how inspiring is that? And yet, at some point, you realize the church bookstore there has more staff employees than I'll have for many, many years. It's something you need to adjust to and adapt to. And so what happens is we sometimes can, based on what we've seen and experienced, set ourselves up for failure with expectations, and we have to fight these battles within ourselves. And I think there's a twofold thing. You don't want to, on the one hand, you don't want to get to the point where you have no faith, no vision, no excitement, because that's bad. But you don't want to get to the other point where your expectations are this high. We're going to be a mega church in this amount of time, and there's nothing to stop us, and it can be so discouraging. We saw there was a guy that came out to New England, and he left within 2 months. 2 months. That's not even enough time to really set up shop and get to know anybody. And so I wish, man, I don't know how he got coached or what happened, but I wish someone had really helped him set some better expectations that for some areas, if you're going to a hard area, you've got to think the long game. God may grow a mega church, he may not, but it's probably not going to happen that fast. It's going to be a slow, steady process, because again, you've got to break up some ground. If there's an area that's saturated by the gospel already, there's some things you don't need to retrace. But in some areas, we need to go and teach them the Bible stories that they've never heard, build on some building blocks, and I know you've experienced that in Miami too. You can't just throw out like Jedediah and people are like, oh yeah, whatever.
Yeah, it's just, we if you're going to minister to people that are just totally unchurched, you're going to have to slow down. You're not going to be able to say, oh, it's like the story of Jonah, and then kind of move on. Most people, they are not going to know. People are coming, the people that we're reaching, and in this generation, more than likely the people that you're going to be reaching, are coming from a totally biblically illiterate background. You're not going to be able to throw out, it's like, in our context, we can talk about, when Jethro talked to Moses, and we kind of, all right, yeah, I got it. They don't know who that is. They don't know who Jethro is. They don't even know who Moses is. So we've just got to, set kind of the expectation and create a context where we just slow down. And that does not mean that you have to water it down. Slowing down and watering down are two totally different things. Teach what you're going to teach. Teach God's word. Teach it verse by verse. But just slow down. Just don't use words like sanctified or glorified or justified without defining them. And that I think is one of the big things that I had to learn, is we use all of those terms. These are important terms for Christians to know. But I have to slow down enough to realize that most people in the audience aren't going to know what those words mean, and I have to define them, and I have to define them every time I use them. Amen. And so that's just an important thing.
Yeah, and let me give you two, when it comes to the battle within, the biggest thing you're going to need to manage are expectations. Internal and external. Let me speak to both of those for a minute. The internal expectations. You may have pressure from on yourself by what you've experienced in an awesome environment, that you're going to get to this level in a certain period of time. Let me share a story that my wife used to help me so much. We were, I was getting so frustrated. We were a few months in, and 20 people showed up, and it's hard to preach your heart out to 20 people. It's just a different experience, a different vibe. And so I got done, and I was frustrated, kind of kicking around, woe is me, feeling sorry for myself, and putting away all the gear. And my wife said to me, she's like, Bill, you really need to enjoy this period, because it's kind of like a kid, and it's only going to be this size one time. And at some time, it's going to grow, and you're going to have more problems. You're going to have a building to deal with. You're going to have staff to deal with. You're going to have people that leave that you wanted to stay. You're going to have people that stay that you wish would leave. And she just told me all of that, and it connected, because I don't know about you, but for those of you that have kids, I've just always savored every moment with I've never been one of these guys, I can't wait till they can do this. I enjoy it every step of the way. So enjoy the process. I know it can be frustrating. I know it can be hard, but you only get that season once. The other thing I would say is the expectations you need to manage in this head game battle are external expectations. This is the danger of people showing up that are churched. People will come, God loves you, and everyone else has a plan for your life. And you've got, I'm sure, some vision and some clarity about what God's asked you to do. And there are going to be people that come and show up and ask, are we going to do this? Are we going to do this? And I'll be honest with you, in the beginning, I made some false promises. I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to lie, but I didn't want to lose
That time
anybody.
you predicted the rapture, though, that was messed up.
It was far enough away, though, I thought I'd be okay. So I shouldn't have told them to sell all their things. But anyway, yeah.
I'm sorry, I missed it.
No. The point is, for example, let me give you an example. We had a family, and I would give, oh, we're going to do this, oh, we're going to do that. And you know what I realized? I finally say this now. People say, oh, are we going to do a men's ministry? Because they think, oh, when we're bigger. I'll just say this now. You know what? We'll probably never do that. We're probably never going to, because we're real big on small groups, and we run women's groups, men's groups, so we don't want to have a million ministries. We want to keep it small, do a few things very, very well. That's our personal, you could be totally different, but I said, we're never going to do that. And I actually had a family that was a young family. They were very active, mature, and they said, are you going to have a youth group? And we do now, but at the time we were really focused on kids. And when I really faced this head on, I had to just say, you know what? We probably aren't going to have that for probably 2 to 3 more years. And I know that's too late for your kids. And I recommended another church in another town that had a really good youth group. You should go there. And that was one of the hardest things you could do. But I felt great doing it because I was no longer giving in to fear and setting up false expectations that I would later have to manage, or trading in the vision for short-term gain. And I'd encourage you, don't ever do that. It's not worth it.
Yeah, we have 6 minutes left. And so I don't know if there's any questions you guys have. If not, we can keep talking, but I thought maybe we could answer some questions that you have, and we'll just give them all to Bill.
2 questions. First off, would you put an ideal number on your team, or would you what would you say of a husband and wife going, or would you say that there needs to be 5 people on a team, or 7 people, or 20? Obviously 20 would be a lot, and then that'd be awesome, man. But and then, what does it look like your first few weeks when you first get there in your city? What does it look like?
Bill, if you want, I'll take the first one, and you can take the second one since the first one's real easy. I wouldn't focus so much on the number as I would focus on the date. When God calls you to go, I would say, hey, this is when we're going. And then I would invite people to go with you. But if you're waiting for whatever your magic number is, oh, well, I'd really love to have 10 or 12 people come with me. What if you have 9? And now you're waiting around another 3 or 4 months just hoping you can talk 3 more people into coming with you. I would say, hey, based on God's call, based on God's timing, this is when we're going to go, and we're going to invite however many people who want to come with us to come with us and be part of this new work.
Yeah. To the second question, what you do when you get there? Well, a lot of that depends. Are you going to be bivocational, or have you raised funds? Now, I raised enough funds from friends back home to set up a website, incorporate, get some equipment, and that kind of a thing, but not enough to support me. So I worked for the first year, and after that I went back and raised funds because I realized I needed to give full time because this was a big work and a lot to do there. And so what I would do the first thing when you get to town, and before you get to town, is set a launch date. Have it on the calendar, figure out a day, pray about that, and there are some strategic times you can figure out when to launch your church, and then back in from there. And then what I would do is every Sunday visit a different church, because you only get to do that one time, because after that Sundays will come with amazing regularity. But by doing that, you get to know the area you're in, get to know some pastors, maybe some ones that you can build friendships with, and the rest of it, man, go out in restaurants, community. If you're working, that's a good way for you to interact with people. Study the area. That is really your time. And it's also plan for your first services. Build your core group. Build the team that you're with. If it's just you and your wife, pray, build that up, and build your plans, and make sure that your setup service is going to go well. I'd encourage you, if you're coming from another church that supports you, maybe pray and ask them to come send a missionary team for that week to come help you. These guys did that it was so helpful for our first service to have a team of people that took the pressure off and helped do that. Now they all went away the next week, so it would have been better if a lot of people had stayed. But I would say really get in and study the area as much as you can.
And then how long was what did you guys set for your launch?
I am the worst person to copy ever, but I'll tell you what we did.
No, yeah,
Within 4 days on the ground, I was working my job. Within 2 months on the ground, we were running weekly services, which was pretty stupid. Honestly, it really was, because we did it too fast. I would have probably slowed down, maybe done some preview services. But you got to do what God tells you to do. So within 2 months, we were doing it. It really all depends. I don't know if you'd change that.
We did weekly Bible studies for about 3 months before we started on Sunday morning. So we were doing midweek. We launched our church in September, and when I say launch, I mean starting Sunday services. And starting in end of May, early June, we started our midweek service, which was in a home. It was just a midweek Bible study, which eventually became our midweek service. But anyway, that was probably about 3 months or so. Maybe 14, 15 weeks before, which that was a great thing for us, because when we were launching, our first service, we had probably about 25 or 30 people coming to our Bible study. And then when we launched our church, I forget how many people were there, but I think it was over 100 the first week that was there. Mark was our executive pastor. He was there the first week. But anyway, does that sound about right, Mark?
Yeah, about 100.
Yeah. So, but the cool thing is, the people that were part of that home Bible study, everyone had a role serving, whether it was in children's ministry or greeting. I would say, I think the question you're not asking that you should be asking, which is what everybody else is thinking, which you're thinking, you don't even realize it. And that is not just how many people and when, but who. And that, I think the thing that we encourage guys to do now, and we send out church planners all the time. We invest in church planners. We give them training. We help church planners. The guys we send out, we help them financially for the first 2 years. But our goal is, when we find a guy that wants to go out, we say, all right, you're going to be the teacher. Who's going to lead worship? Who's the guy that's going to do that? Because sometimes we think, well, we're just going to find a guy who plays guitar. And Bill has a wonderful testimony to talk about that. Bill's going to write a book, I think, called Worship Leader Nightmares. But
Not now. Our worship leader now is phenomenal.
Dave is worship leader. He's a good guy.
It ended well.
He'll write the foreword. But I think what you don't want to do is put yourself in a position where it's like, well, what are we going to do? And then it's like, you got like the 80s LL Cool J boombox, and you're playing tapes.
It's okay as long as you hide the lyrics on the little.
Yeah. So, but I think you want to have, when you start, people only experience your church for the first time once. So you want to make sure when they show up that you're really putting your best foot forward. Amen. And I think that's an important thing. We officially answered one question in this. Yes, sir.
I just have a question. Since you were ministering in Miami, how difficult is it, and what obstacles did you have to overcome to minister to cultural Catholics? And is there any advice you could give anybody that wants to minister in that area?
I'll tell you one thing that we don't do that a lot of churches do is we don't attack Catholics.
Yeah.
That does help.
Yeah. The Crusades are over. So,
Good to know.
as fun as they were. Good times. But one of the things that, like I'll give you an example, like infant baptism. There are guys, and they're good-meaning pastors, and we're going to be faithful to tell them that it doesn't mean anything. And we understand, that what the Bible says, 1 Peter, the baptism is the pledging of a good conscience towards God. We know that in the scriptures, it's always adults that are baptized. But see, if I come from a very confrontational and in some ways offensive approach, it doesn't translate.
Do you still give them Dave Hunt's "A Woman Rides the Beast"?
Yeah, no,
Oh.
we don't. We give them the two Babylon songs. We find that because we like the fish hat diagrams, which is really only funny if you've read that book. So we'll have we'll start a book club. But anyway, but what happens is this, and this is just to give you an example, like the baptism issue. One of the things that we say now, for us, we have a baptism class because we want people to understand what baptism is. And but one of the things that we do is we will say, if you come from this kind of background, the Catholic background. I came from a Catholic background before I came to know the Lord. But one of the things that we'll say is, when your parents baptized you as an infant, that spoke about your parents' faith. Now you've got to make a decision that speaks about your faith. And so what I don't want to do is just tell them, it didn't mean anything, even though it has deep significance to their parents. Instead, I think we can see the same outcome, which is someone making a decision, pledging their conscience towards God, identifying with Christ, his death as they go into the water, identifying with the resurrection when they come out. I think we can see all of that without being needlessly offensive. As we like to say, the cross is offensive. Let's not add to that. If that's going to, if the cross is going to offend them, that's that. But I don't want to take another issue and make it needlessly offensive.
And in the Northeast, we have a lot of Catholics too, and they're hungry. They're joining churches, evangelical churches left and right. I have people come up to me, an 80-year-old woman, and she said, I've never heard the Bible taught like that, and I've gone to Mass my whole life, which, I mean, in one sense, oh, you can feel good until you think about it and feel so sad for people like that, but there are people that God is sending to our churches, so yeah, I think you'll see more and more of that all over.
Yeah. And when we taught Revelation and we got to Church of Thyatira, we were straight up. You got to really teach the
I
text.
got email on that.
Yeah, but I'm saying, like, if you're teaching the text and it offends someone who's from a different persuasion, there's nothing you can do about that. When you're just kind of going out of your way to say things that are just going to hack people off, that's not really productive. So, you guys say that, hack people? I don't know. Sorry. I guess we say that. It grieves them. Yeah. Any other questions, thoughts, comments? Yes, sir?
I know you had mentioned about setting up a web page, and all that when you're starting up. When you're starting up, how important is social media?
Well, yeah, social media is huge. 8 out of 10 people that will visit your church will go to your website. If you don't have a website, they will think that the invite they got or something was a joke. Like, oh no, wow, they were trying to punk me by sending me to some school or something, and there was a church there. You want to have a website. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, and you just want to know, what are people looking for? They want to know who you are, where you're located. They want to know how long your services are, and what should I wear. And if you want to add a fifth one, what are you going to do with my kids? Yeah. That's what they want to know. If you have 8 pages on your statement of faith, that's fine, but I'm just saying that's probably not going to be, if you look on your back end, that's not going to be the page that's clicked on the most. If you go on our page, which is calvarywired.com, you'll see a button that says before you visit, and you can feel free to just take that if you want. Guys, I'm amazed at how many churches have, because I say that all the time when I go speak, and I'll go visit somewhere, and I'm going to go visit a church, and I'll see the before you visit page that I wrote. Which is funny. But if you look on there, we just answer like the top 8 or 10 questions. Am I going to be singled out in any way? Because that's what people are terrified of, being singled out. People are terrified of, like, what are you going to do with my kids? Is this going to take all day? Because you could say, we have 2 services at 9 and 11. That doesn't mean anything. There's a movie theater down the street from your house, just like this movie theater down the street from my house, that has movies starting every 15 minutes. And the movies aren't 15 minutes long. They're all overlapping. People don't think about, I got to turn over the parking lot and empty out the children's ministry, fill it up again. People don't think like that. You got to tell them, our service is 75 minutes. That's how long our service is, and we tell them that. And they are identical services. We tell them that too, because we're not assuming that people know anything. Because once again, in our context, most people really don't have any church background, so we're trying to fill in as many questions as we can. But we are...
Can I add one thing to that? Because he asked specifically about social media.
Yes.
Very, very important. And on our website, it's calvaryhartford.com. You can check it out. Same thing with theirs, though. We have Facebook links on every single page of our site. The reason for that is Facebook falls into one of those tools to help your people become evangelical partners with you. So we post messages, we post all kinds of things. We encourage people to check in when they're there. People see that in their streams and social medias. So it is huge, probably more than we could talk about how to use that effectively because we're out of time. But I would say it's a very, very effective tool.
No, that's good. We wanted to do something for you guys that were here, if you're interested. I have a book that I wrote about 3 years ago. It's called 0 to 60. It's kind of 60 principles and practices for leading a growing church. A lot of church planners, grab hold of it. I would love to give you a free copy of it. If Mark is over here, we have a little card. If you just put your name, you don't have to fill everything out. You put your name and email address. We'll email you the PDF of the book, and you can load it in your Kindle or your iPad or whatever. If you're so interested, if you don't read, then don't worry about it.
And I'll send you an audio file too. Top 3 mistakes I made as a church planner. So hopefully some good things you guys can avoid too. Learn good things, but learn mistakes too. So
Yeah. All right. Well, hey, can I pray for you guys, and then we'll be done? Lord, thanks so much for this time we've had together. I pray for each and every person in this room. Lord, those who are thinking of planting, those who put their hand to the plow already, I pray that you would bless their efforts. I pray that your Son would be glorified. And we look forward, God, to seeing so many more people in your kingdom because of the work that's being done. because of these men and women that are giving of themselves and taking risks, taking steps of faith, steps of obedience as they follow you. God, go before them, do a great work. In Jesus' name.